Thank you all for coming today or watching this video in this virtual APA. So I am Nick Johnson, and I am an assistant professor of counseling psychology at Lehigh University, and I'm lucky enough to be the discussant today. I'm going to open briefly, just give you a little bit of background, and then introduce our amazing presenters, and then let them take it over. So sexual violence is a critical concern in the US and around the world, and one area that has received considerable attention recently due to high rates of sexual assaults is the college campus. Although significant attention has been given to college campuses, rates of sexual violence remain high, suggesting the importance of additional efforts. My colleagues and I created what we call a bystander plus model of rape prevention to do just that. And I am honored to hear the work that has been done around this model here today. So first, my colleague and co-creator of the Bystander Plus model, Mike Catteray, is going to be discussing with us the application of the Bystander Plus model to rape culture. And then my student, Marley Corbett-Hone, is going to be discussing with us our efforts to adapt a part of the Bystander Plus model, define it, for LGBTQ students. And then finally, unfortunately, Josie was not able to be here with us today. And so Mike will take the reins again and then be discussing results examining a key component of the Bystander Plus model, thinking about critical consciousness through the program Define It. So I will let you both take it over.
Thank you, Nikki. So our first presentation is looking at the combined effects of both bystander education, so traditional bystander education, and the Define It model, and this is what we have termed the Bystander Plus program. So, as Dr. Johnson said, there's a lot of research out there that underscores the problem that is faced on college campuses around sexual violence, and especially around rape on college campuses. And so there's high statistics reporting that many women are facing unwanted sexual experiences, and that's both generally but also specific to college campuses. In order to address this, there's been several programs that we've modeled the Bystander Plus prevention after, and those have shown to be very efficacious. So, and the efficacy that is there is increasing pro-social behavior, bystander behaviors. So these are things like rating higher confidence and being able to intervene. And we see that a large effect being present for the efficacy, and then also decreased rape myth acceptance, which we'll talk about a little bit in this study as being a good proxy for rape culture. So we know that bystander programming is one of the most efficacious forms of prevention for sexual assault and sexual violence. So, as Dr. Johnson mentioned in the introduction, even though we know this, and even though students who are going through this program have more awareness, maybe some of their opinions are changing, and certainly their confidence is changing, sexual violence remains a problem on college campuses. And so thinking about what isn't happening in translation between what's happening in our bystander programs and what people are reporting, and then what is happening in kind of real world scenarios on college campuses. So what we want to know, and the questions that we are left with, is how do we, instead of just changing confidence and efficacy, which are all very important and are part of the equation, how do we also start to tap into culture and think about what is this rape culture that is supportive and sustaining of sexual violence? So in order to do that, we really are examining, in this study specifically, rape culture and changing the components of that through this Bystander Plus model. So rape culture as a theoretical construct looks at traditional gender roles, looks at hostility towards women, looks at acceptance of violence, and so this is what we then used as an outcome. So the program, very much like other programs, consisted of approximately about 60-minute bystander education component. So looked at pro-social bystander behaviors, disrupting rape myths, increasing the awareness of rape culture. The plus content is the program that we'll refer to a couple more times today, which is called Define It. And Define It is really around the idea of examining rape supportive ideologies and working from this idea of building critical consciousness around rape supportive behaviors. So our method was a quasi-experimental design to assess the Bystander Plus program. We had approximately a 90-minute class time that we used to do the standard bystander training, which is modeled after bringing in the bystander, which we called Empowering the Bystander. And that was followed with 1 week in between a 90-minute consciousness raising group, which is Define It. So what we used to measure was the rape culture inventory, which taps into all these single constructs and factors of what we would consider and what the literature considers rape culture. And so this, developed by our discussant, Dr. Johnson, looks at traditional masculine gender role norms, traditional feminine gender roles, hostile sexism, benevolent sexism, adversarial sexual beliefs, hostility toward women, and acceptance of violence. And so that these are all very much associated with what we would deem as rape culture. So our intervention group participants were college students. It was part of a human development class that we went into for undergraduate students. We did 2 successive weeks of our intervention with them. For those that completed pre-post in 1 month, in total was 23 college students, and we're all around traditional college age. For our control group, it was 58 college students, and this was part of the Introduction to Psychology pool. And so students completed those surveys at the same time frames as our intervention groups, and were on average younger. And so that was a little bit of a difference and something we had to control for in our results. So our results controlling for time 1 and then looking for outcomes time 2 and 1 month follow-up showed that the intervention group differed significantly than the control group on rape culture overall, so their overall endorsement of rape culture as measured by the rape culture inventory, with significant reductions in masculine gender roles and the acceptance of violence. Now this is listed twice because the measure asks both for my personal beliefs, right, and also those that I believe of the larger campus or community. And so we saw both personal beliefs changing, but also what students were reflecting on, what they saw in kind of the larger campus, which we know is important for prevention, because oftentimes people will look outside themselves and say, well, this is the norm of the culture, this is the norm of my community. Even if I feel different, I'm still going to go along with it. And so we saw that this was both impacting personal and other beliefs. And so to look at these just more visually, right, the green line is our control group, and the blue line is our intervention group. And we see that from time 1 to time 3, our intervention group is lowering significantly, while our control group is rising. And we thought this was pretty interesting as well because, as I mentioned earlier, our control group was, an introduction to psychology course, and they were doing this as part of the psych pool, and so they were younger on average. And so what we don't have any, what we can kind of postulate or maybe consider as part of this is that the socialization through the year or through that time period even in college increases some of these rape normative beliefs, and that the students that were in our intervention group starting at time 1 were higher, and that they were more likely to be in their second or third year of college, and so that might be more where these things solidify. And so that if part of the socialization experience of college campuses is to start to have these ideologies of rape culture, there can also be a rewind on that, or a deconstruction of those beliefs. And so this is perceived beliefs of the community, and we see a similar trajectory of our outcomes. So once again, green is control and blue is our intervention group. So when we take this as a whole, this is a very brief intervention. If we think 2 weeks and just 90 minutes for each week, that something as brief as this can have a lasting effect. 1 month prior, we still saw lasting effects and decreases of rape culture beliefs. And so that this combined model is something to really pay attention to. It's not to say that that the same effects couldn't have happened with just an educational approach, but what it points us to is to say, what is really at play here and what sustains these effects overall. So some of the things that we'll talk about in the next 2 presentations is really to think about how do we consider these guided group discussions that are aimed at dismantling rape supportive ideologies, that also focus on a lot of those emotional and cognitive tensions that students are likely to experience, right? So I can say in a hypothetical that I feel confident in doing something, but likely there are lots of emotional, cognitive difficulties in actually translating my beliefs into action. And so how do we address that in these discussion components and help students work through those as well?
Okay, so thank you for that presentation, Dr. Cataray. My presentation is going to build off of that in terms of discussing a study that we've done on consciousness raising conversations with the LGBTQ plus community on rape culture and bystander behavior. So to set this off, we're talking about how to specifically apply sexual violence prevention programming specifically to the LGBTQ plus community. And the reason why we wanted to do this is because when we look at the statistics and rates of sexual violence within this community in particular, we notice some disturbing trends. The first is that for sexual minority individuals, specifically lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals, we know that these individuals experience equal or higher rates of sexual violence in comparison to heterosexual individuals. And I have a graph right below of data from the CDC showing that. So for on the far left, I'm sorry that the words are a little small, bisexual women there, 74.9% of bisexual women report experiencing sexual violence. And then it goes down from there to bisexual men at 47.3%, lesbian women at 46.4%, heterosexual women at 43.3%, gay men at 40.2%, and heterosexual men at 20.8%. And then even disturbing as well is that transgender individuals experience even greater risk than these, and these were already very high risks, with rates at more than twice those reported by cisgender, lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. And despite this really heightened risk, the current conversation surrounding rape prevention, specifically that on college campuses, but also more broadly, has consistently minimized and or ignored the LGBTQ plus community. And it's done this in a few different ways. One is that often programming uses heteronormative language that alienates members of the LGBTQ plus community. So we're often finding that programming uses examples of sexual violence perpetration as an act that is perpetrated specifically by heterosexual men towards heterosexual women, and often we do not talk about the wider variety beyond that specific example. Often, additionally, programming will use language that infers an assumed gender binary, and this can be really alienating the LGBTQ plus individuals who are in the audience and trying to benefit from these programs. So the goal of our study was to identify and integrate the specific and unique needs of the LGBTQ plus community into the existing Define It program that Dr. Ketteray just talked about. And the way that we did this was through a two-part process. The first thing that we did was to gather stakeholder feedback regarding what they thought the unique needs of the LGBTQ plus community would be. And to do this, we assessed current prevention providers, a sample of 15 total stakeholders, 2 directors of university centers that deliver this type of programming, including the LGBTQ campus organization and the Gender Violence Prevention Organization, 5 peer educators, and 8 graduate students who specifically study and focus on sexual violence prevention programming. And then the second part of the study was then to use that feedback to develop a program develop the Define It program that would be specifically related to LGBTQ plus individuals, and delivered it then to the 2 focus groups of LGBTQ plus university students. We had a total of 6 students participate in this. 4 of them were graduate students and 2 were undergraduate, and I have listed below some of their demographic information. Really briefly, the method that we used for this study after we gathered all the data was a qualitative descriptive methodology. We chose this methodology because it allows for really data-near interpretations of narrative data, trying to remain as close to the participants' feedback as possible in our analysis. So we used low inference content analysis accordingly. We also used feminist ethnography. We had several ethnographers in the focus group sections, and we used that data to add additional context to that data. Then we employed purposive sampling. We used the semi-structured focus group guidelines from Define It, and then did an investigation of inter-rater agreement as well. So these are, in brief, our findings. First, many of our participants talked about LGBTQ plus specific experiences of rape culture. The first related to heterosexism and transphobia specifically. They talked about how institutions of power fail to adequately respond to LGBTQ individuals when they've experienced sexual violence. And as a result, their help seeking is often affected. We're seeing lower rates of help seeking, and many participants talked about feeling stigmatization, invalidation, and shame. Specifically related to their identities, and then adding on to those experiences of sexual violence. They also really interestingly talked about pervasive and unique rape myths regarding the LGBTQ community. The first is this idea of erasing LGBTQ individuals' sexual preferences. One participant stated an experience of a peer in the community who had an instance where she brought her girlfriend to a frat party, was kissing her girlfriend, and a guy pulled her away and said, "No, you should be kissing me instead," and then forced himself on her. So our participants really reflected these experiences of where heterosexism and the rape culture interact in unique ways. The other thing that became clear in our data was that LGBTQ individuals face an assumption of sexual deviance because they hold either sexual or gender minority identities. Often individuals would assume that they were sexually deviant and enjoyed sexual victimization. One example from the study was this quote from a participant. He stated, "I feel like the perpetrator can say, 'Oh, he likes it, he's gay.' And then other people will also think that, like, oh, he should like it because he's gay, and gay people like all men." Additionally, participants talked about the role of intersectionality, where race, class, and other identities interacted with their identities to increase the stigmatization that they experienced. Which leads us to our findings, which we came up with a series of recommendations for adapting and creating sexual violence prevention programming that meets the needs specifically of the LGBTQ plus community. The first is the importance of really recognizing the value of allyship in your programming. And this starts by preparing your facilitators adequately to meet the needs of this population. First, be sure that you're educating facilitators on and unpacking with them these LGBTQ plus specific stereotypes. Next, train facilitators in effective helping skills, moving beyond advice and suggestions and active challenging to more reflection, and really helping to respect the perspectives of participants. Again, something that we found specifically was to encourage explicit disclosure of facilitator identities. Often LGBTQ individuals are very comfortable or are more comfortable than heterosexual individuals at discussing their sexual and gender identities, and we need to help facilitators be able to engage and feel comfortable engaging in these conversations and prepare them to actively discuss identities, including that explicit emphasis on intersectionality. The next thing that we found was the importance of providing early and ongoing programming. Participants reflected that stereotypes fester without adequate and early education and discussion. One participant said, "I feel where it could be addressed as far as nationally is creating a national curriculum that is inclusive of different sexualities and making one that also includes, hey, this is what consent looks like, and this is all the ways that are not consent. Give the resources, teach the kids, start young, we'll learn better." Close quote. Additionally, we found this recommendation, and this applies for all populations, not just LGBTQ plus populations, but to have repeated brief interventions. This helps to hold the attention more. As participants moved into the second hour of focus groups, we saw their attention dwindling and their participation dwindling as well, and that's just part of being human. So having repeated brief interventions is more helpful and can reinforce the past learning over multiple exposures. Next, increase comfort of LGBTQ plus participants within programming as a whole. We found it valuable to offer the option for closed LGBTQ plus groups, but also offer individuals the option to attend open groups that are not restricted based off of LGBTQ plus identity as well. We found this is based off the fact that we found that some of our participants felt more comfortable discussing these really sensitive topics related to sexuality, gender, and sexual violence with others who hold similar identities and experiences. However, we should simultaneously encourage even open groups that are available to all students to engage in dialogue that is sensitive to LGBTQ individuals. Lastly, we find it important to attend to LGBTQ plus specific rape culture topics regardless of the audience. So whether or not you're specifically targeting your intervention to meet LGBTQ plus students' needs, all interventions should include this component. This is partly based off the fact that further analysis after the study of pre, post, and follow-up data of LGBTQ plus participants in the Define It program hinted at ceiling effects. Essentially, the interpretation of this is that they already came into these interventions with pretty high levels of consciousness raised around rape culture and the way that that affects their identities. They're very aware of these things, but that we hypothesize that the larger college student community may not be as aware, and that all can benefit from this awareness. Additionally, participants, regardless of sexual identity and sexuality, benefit from discussions that reflect the LGBTQ plus experience. It makes a safer culture for all. Lastly, and the point that I would like you to take home from this presentation is really the power of consciousness raising applied to LGBTQ plus experiences of sexual violence. Essentially, programming that expands our definitions of sexual interactions beyond those heterosexist norms can really help individuals to better recognize and intervene with sexual violence that doesn't fit those really strict stereotypical expectations, benefiting not just LGBTQ plus students, but the larger community as well. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me or my advisor, Dr. Nicole Johnson, and you can find this study and more information in Psychology and Sexuality. And here's our references.
All right. Thank you, Marley. That was wonderful. I have the honor of presenting the last one here. This is a study that was just completed in the spring in cooperation with my former graduate student, Josie Albrecht, who's unable to attend for this virtual platform. And so I'm going to take her slides and let you know a little bit about our implementation of the Define It program with student leaders and on a college campus. I can find my... So if we think broadly about the goal of Bystander Plus program, was really to expand awareness and create actionable change. And so what we did here is really try and isolate the Define It program to see how that impacts behaviors, rape culture supportive behaviors, but also to really focus on how this might increase critical consciousness among participants who are part of this program. So we've talked about that a couple times, and so I just want to give a brief overview of what we're talking about when we say critical consciousness. And so there's a few definitions that follow with this. Critical consciousness is really steeped in the work of Freire, who was an educator, in thinking about how do we bring a different type of literacy about social and political issues. And so if we think about rape culture being within an ideology that supports sexism, misogyny, violence against women, other types of sexual violence, and marginalization of others, then how do we engage in what Watts, Deemer, and Voigt would say is critical reflection, political efficacy, and critical action, but instead really pointing that towards this realm of rape culture and rape supportive ideologies. And so a key component of critical consciousness is this notion of critical dialogue. So how do we have conversations, engage people in conversations to explore their own process of socialization and both the socialized experience but also the political sphere and how these are impacting their shared beliefs or individual beliefs about their community and the world around them, and then examine those, right? So then this is really that idea of dismantling. And so from that, and from within the Define It group and how it was developed, was to have these conversations, but then not just leave it at that, but really think, what's the next step then? So I have this new information, what do I do with it? How do I then change the world around me in response to what I've learned and what I've reflected on? And so we've seen in some of the research that a focus on critical consciousness or these kind of consciousness-raising groups can have lasting individual and community effects. We see that with HIV prevention, with women's mental health, and other violence prevention programs. And so a lot of the Define It program is how do we then bring this into the realm of sexual assault prevention, and specifically on college campuses. So when we think about rape culture with critical consciousness and how that's these two have interacted, that we've seen some association of those who have higher critical consciousness endorsing lower levels of rape acceptance and higher levels of willingness to take action to prevent sexual assault. And so with this kind of notion of critical consciousness, just kind of emerging within the literature and the research, there seems to be positive directions that we're seeing there. So the objective of the current study was to evaluate the influence of the Define It program with students on Chatham University's campus who were student leaders and who had gone through, as part of their orientation as leaders, the Green Dot program. So Green Dot is a well-established, very efficacious bystander education program. And so all the students that participated in these groups had completed a weekend training in that. They had done that as part of their training to be student leaders. And so that having that baseline, then that everybody's completed that, we're now looking to see, well, what are the additive effects of having these critical dialogues through the Define It program. So the Define It program itself, if we structured it into 4 different phases, would consist of a brainstorming phase, and this is really to discuss, all right, well, how do we understand consent? How do we understand rape culture? How do we see these things within our own environment and a larger kind of social environment? Reflect a little bit then on how these things came to be, how they exist, and what we feel about them personally, to have some of that kind of self-examination and then collective examination. Then discuss this, discuss how we feel about them, discuss why they're there, discuss our reactions, discuss our emotions, and then that's followed by an action phase, which really looks at how do I take accountability to this group, to myself, and think about even what can I do in the next 24 hours. If it's something as small and incremental as finding out more information, visiting a website, joining a group, doing some type of advocacy. In our group, we even had somebody, their actionable stage was, I'm just going to, at the dinner table tonight, I'm going to bring this up. My family doesn't talk about this, and I feel like it's something that they should. And so that was, an action step that we had. Oops. So the participants that we had were undergraduate student leaders. They completed the Green Dot program. 13 were able to join us in the groups. I think in total we had 4 groups, if I'm remembering correctly. And the people were randomly assigned to those groups as to where they could to participate. So what we're really looking at then is what is the outcomes for Define It when it's paired with a standard bystander program. So like we saw in the first study, that's a bystander plus model is what we're terming it. So here we are combining it, but we're only studying, we're isolating the Define It program to see the effects there. So for this study specifically, we were in the middle of the pandemic or the beginning of the pandemic, and so maybe this shows some efficacy for also holding these groups in a virtual environment as we all are existing in now. And so we were able to run these through Zoom calls, and there were some limitations to that, in the sense that people are joining at different times. There's not the normal kind of relational components of sitting in a small group and talking, or having kind of smaller conversations between people as they enter the room. Technology issues, some people joining in late or getting kicked off or whatever it might be, and then having to come back in. But the benefits were really that we were able to continue with these groups. It was flexible. I think that as we ended them, a lot of people were also saying that it was really nice to have the conversation, to be connected. These are all student leaders, and so similar to the data that Marley presented, are already kind of very conscious and engaged in this type of work and thinking about these types of issues. And so to have the forum for that, I think was beneficial as well, and that's what we heard from them. So we did a pre and post and 1 month data for the 13 participants. We had collected information on 3 different scales. So the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale. So this would be a good proxy for rape culture, and certainly holds many similar subscales as the rape culture inventory, although is not as comprehensive. We used a standard critical consciousness inventory, and so this is just overall thinking more of that reflective action, political advocacy, etc. And then we used a bystander scale that is specifically focused on critical consciousness raising, and to see the outcomes that we might find. Oops. So here is the results. Results that were significant on mainly on our critical consciousness bystander subscales. And so those would be the sexual harassment bystander behavior, the consciousness raising for bystander behavior, and the activism and advocacy for bystander behavior. So those are 3 of the 4 subscales for the critical consciousness bystander behavior measure. And in addition, on the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale, we had the She Asked For It subscale that was also significant in reducing the acceptance of those rape myth beliefs at our post measure. So just to show you some of the items that fit into these different areas, this is the 3 subscales of the critical consciousness bystander scale where we had significant results. Items would look similar to what we see here, and so people are thinking about how they might intervene or what they might do. This is from the past. Our questions were future-oriented or hypothetically oriented, but the content is the same. This is for critical or consciousness raising. So speaking up, false statements, both about sexual harassment, having conversations, engaging others. And so these were, even if I think to just the conversations that we had in the group, these were definitely areas where students said they felt more empowered or felt more of a sense of immediacy to take these types of actions. Inviting friends and family to raise awareness about sexual assault or harassment, being involved in organizations, checked out apps or other things, and so these were also behaviors that students were more likely to engage in, and this fitting with that consciousness-raising, political efficacy kind of model, critical action type models. And then for the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale, this is the She Asked For It, some of the items from that subscale. And so these really are in line with rape myth beliefs, and so we saw significant decreases in these. Other preliminary results that we have from this study included some of the common topics from the intervention groups, and so we were able to use kind of a shared document format. So as people talked about things, either myself or Josie, who is my co-leader in these groups, would jot down what people were saying, just so people could refer back to it, but also so that they could kind of see their topics. And when we revisited all of the topics that we had talked about at the end of the group, people were able to have a visual of that. And so these are some of the main themes that came out from that. People believing that rape culture is normalized, perpetuated by silence and victim blaming. Rape culture is the result of power imbalances, which are gendered. And these were really around, how do we understand rape culture? What is kind of our understanding of it? Different expectations that were in relationships, or that sex is an expectation. So if you're in a relationship, that's just something that is expected of you. That there is not enough conversation about verbal consent. And also that why does this continue to happen is oftentimes because perpetrators don't feel that they'll be held accountable. And so that with our condonement or our kind of silence around these topics, we're allowing these things to be perpetually happening. Something that's similar to what Marley had found was also that a lot of people talked about really should have had this education in high school, that abstinence education was kind of the one place where they really had any conversations about their sexuality and sexual behaviors, and that was not sufficient. And so thinking about what can we do in younger age groups to begin to talk about consent, to begin to talk about sexuality and sexual behaviors, to start to normalize those conversations, and think also about what can we do to prevent rape culture ideology being part of that. So some of the action steps that students took in our last stage were really to think about, as I just spoke to, sex education. So how do we change the content? How do we change what age it's introduced? How do we make it more gender inclusive and not contributing to stigmas? How do we have daily conversations that are changing the master narrative? And so students were really, that took part in the groups, were really thinking more daily about how do I examine what's happening around me in my conversations, in my classrooms, in my meetings, and start to really resist against that. Being involved in petitions and marches, reaching out to local officials, several of our students had been born and raised in Pittsburgh, and so this was one of those areas where they knew their superintendent of schools, and so I think one of our students was even saying, I've been thinking about actually running for that position, and so trying to come from that viewpoint and knowledge base to enact change. Normalize talking about sex and pleasure, taking some personal responsibility to have conversation with partners, family, and friends, to engage more in social media, so to not let things go unseen, and to also repost or challenge other things that that our participants said they found enlightening or engaging or made them stop and think, and then almost most importantly, to find support systems that they can have to help when doing this work, and these groups were kind of some beginning of that for these students. So, as we know, or as we're seeing from this study alone, research indicates that students reflected upon the action steps they had previously taken, and that they were thinking more about how to raise critical consciousness, how to engage more in their bystander intervention training. Green Dot was certainly alluded to several times in our discussions, and what it showed was that it was a wonderful foundation for these students. And our conversation with that then engaged them in a level to say, how do I really start to take responsibility for those actions, and starting to really bring that into place in the campus and my larger community. And so we also saw an increase in activism and advocacy from some of their statements and what they indicated on post surveys as far as the types of actions that they would take.
I just want to say thank you to both Dr. Cataray and Marley for presenting on this exciting studies and information about the Bystander Plus model. When Mike and I and some of our other colleagues were thinking about this model, what really came to us was when we were going through the literature, the bystander model was the thing that was really standing out and showing to actually make changes. But a lot of the changes that we saw were kind of short-term changes, so pre-post, and then if there was a long-term follow-up, kind of seeing some of those things fall off the wayside. And then also really thinking more about attitudinal change and less about behavioral change, and so seeing like actual steps being taken to change the culture. And so we had a lot of conversations about what could we do to try and make that change possible and sustainable, and what it kept coming back to, I think for us, I don't know, Mike, if you agree, but was sort of the culture. Mm-hmm. And so if you're engaging in a wonderful program and you're like, yes, I'm into this, I want to make a difference, but then you go back into that culture that really holds these beliefs about men should act this way, women should act this way, and violence is acceptable and it's sometimes like a stimulating idea, as Marley was talking about for the queer community. And so I think we really pushed to think about how to have those, and what we kept coming back to and what Mike really brought in was this like critical dialogue. And so how we were all training to be counseling psychologists, and the things that I think we've learned the most from is really just engaging in that conversation and meeting participants and people where they're at, sort of helping move them forward. And so I think that's where Define It sort of came from. And I know for me, that's always been my favorite thing to lead. And it's really because I have a lot of ideas in my head and I can give a lot of facts and information, but the sort of excitement comes when the individuals are actually coming up with that themselves. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we think this component, and research, early research is showing that it can have a positive effect. And so I think what we wanted to share with you all is really the thing to do is to not just have a one-time program, but how do we continue that conversation, and how do we give students skills to be able to engage that conversation even outside of programming. So something we really focus on and Define It is not just this conversation stays here, but how do you take this conversation out into the larger culture and continue to have this conversation? Because as we saw, a lot of students know that's really what's going to lead to cultural change, rather than just kind of a one-time intervention and expecting that to have long-lasting impacts. Those are my thoughts.
Great. I don't know how much time we have, and I can just edit this out if we don't.
Yeah.
But I would like to respond to some of the questions that you had. So would you like to have the discussion, Marley, about them too?
Cool. Do you want to talk about them first before we record, or do you want to just record?
No, let's just do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we're good.
Well, I feel we're in the flow now that we're going.
Yeah. All right. So I have the exciting opportunity now, since unfortunately we aren't live, to ask some questions, some burning questions that I have for our two presenters. So the first question that I have is, why do you think conscious raising and developing critical consciousness are so important in preventing sexual violence?
Do you want to go first, Mark? We can switch on and off. You want me to go first? You want to go first?
Go for it.
You want me to go first? Okay. Yeah, I think that these conversations are something, and I think from early on, when Dr. Johnson and I were both graduate students and we had piloted this program, and I think one of the first groups we went to was the LGBTU group, right?
Yep.
And having those conversations, I think, was one of these things where it's like, instead of being a passive recipient of information, and not that this is the model completely for bystander education, and I think I can't reiterate it or say it enough that like the bystander plus model is contingent upon a baseline of education, and so this isn't to say that that isn't necessary and important. But it is a little more passive in that you're thinking and you're starting to engage with these things at some level. But the conversations that we would have within these groups would really take it to a deeper place. And it really showed more ownership of thought, more ownership of how I'm thinking and feeling and interacting with these ideas. Because I think there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and then doing something. And this is a prime time for that, not just about sexual violence, but around a number of different issues, is that people can really be engaged intellectually, but maintain a status quo, maintains ideologies that are supportive of several different types of oppression and intersecting oppressions, and not engage in any kind of critical action that moves them forward, and also starts to change the culture and dismantle some of these systems of oppression. And so, I think that's why it's really necessary, and also why it's so engaging, not only as for participants, but also as facilitators of these groups.
Great. Marley, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm trying not to jump ahead to one of the additional questions. But,
welcome to.
I think it's really highlighting the role of the action phase of the Define It program with that critical consciousness raising focus. Just watching the program take place, participants really create their own meaning and bring their own meaning to it. And like you said, Dr. Catteray, bringing in different types of oppression and personal experiences and the way that intersects. But I really like watching participants take their own spin on the action versus some other types of education or programming that they might experience, which, while valuable, maybe offer them a list of options for like, this is the way that you can take action. I think it's really powerful for participants to, at the end of these programs, come up with those actions on their own. And kind of the examples that you highlighted in your last presentation really spoke to that, of people were thinking of things that we as facilitators and program developers really can't develop for them, right? They're putting it into their own context and their own experience and defining the action that within their own culture makes the most sense. And I think that that's a really, really powerful component of the critical consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I could just echo, being someone who's facilitated Define It groups a lot. It's just such a cool thing to be a part of. Like, I remember I've done a lot of educational programming, and bystander stuff is great. Like, I feel like I give a lot of information. But the conscious raising, critical consciousness, I feel like moved like by it. And so I think that's kind of a part of what I hear y'all saying, is it's like this addition, but the foundation is necessary, right? When we're learning about anything, you need that foundation in order to engage with things in a meaningful way. And that's why we really think there's both of these components are necessary.
I just want to add one more thing too, because I think Marley, you brought this up, and then Nikki, you alluded to it, and it's really the idea that students and any participant in this, so it's not, I don't think that the group is necessarily just for college campuses, but even when we start with it, it's kind of like being a presenter. You don't know what you're going to get. It's kind of some part. So you have this framework in your own mind of things that you want to make sure people get to or kind of think about, but you're not sure what people are going to bring. And I think that's the idea, that if we think about socialization being a collaborative, kind of constructive, socially constructed process, the same way to deconstruct that has to be through the same kind of methods. And so how do we use each other to reflect and kind of create a different narrative about what our experiences are and what we want them to be going forward. And so I think that is, such a big component, is that the discussion groups are a creation of all of their own each time, and it's unique in that way.
Yeah, definitely. So my other question, which I touched on a little bit from my perspective of why I think rape culture is so important to address, but I wonder if either of you had any additional thoughts about it is, right, from our thinking of the Bystander Plus model is really to center rape culture. Why do you think that's so important?
I went first last time.
I mean, so this programming does not occur in a vacuum, right? This programming does not occur in a very clean, sterile environment where we get to, kind of like you were just talking about, infuse brand new knowledge without any prior socialization or learning. We already are all living and are steeped in this rape culture. So if we fail to address that, we shouldn't be surprised that effects then end up not lasting or lingering long term, just like you said before, Dr. Johnson.
Even translating into behavior, like Dr. Catteray was saying about, like, I can think one thing or believe something's wrong, but if I think my peers support that or that's the norm, that's likely going to get in the way for a lot of people to actually take action, right? So, yeah.
I disagree.
Yeah, I think, which it's important. We agree with that. So I guess my last question that I'll ask, because I think y'all talked, I was going to ask a little bit about how students responded to define it, but it sounds like we covered that they were like, good, and still felt that they had things to learn, even from having previous trainings. So what do you all see as the next steps for Bystander Plus prevention programming? Where do we go from here?
I guess it's my turn to go first.
Yeah.
I think it's like one of those things, and we talk about this in research, of like the etic versus the emic approaches, right? And certainly bystander education programs have followed that etic kind of general, how do we generalize these things? How do we take them? How do we put them and package them to go to a lot of different places? And I think there's some ways that social change happens that way, but most of the time I think it is from kind of bottom up. And so, my hope for this program and for Bystander Plus programs is that colleges continue to engage in the important work of bystander education and make sure that those models are in place, and that every single student has been exposed to it, at least to the point where they have the language to be able to talk about these things, right? So they can't say they don't know. They might not internalize it, they might not believe it, they might not change their beliefs as a result of it, but they have the language so that these concepts and ideas aren't coming out of nowhere. And then I think that the other component is that student groups and other vested faculty and staff, whether it's in student affairs or residence life, or it's coming from psychology and counseling centers, are really engaged in doing these critical discussions and having those at student groups, having that as part of residence life programming, and that people, take what we've learned from running these groups and use that as kind of, well, here's what I should be considering. Here's how I should kind of model what's appropriate and how I should guide discussions, because certainly there's a level of learning and knowledge that needs to come with that, but then to just kind of leave it to students to really think critically about what do I want to do to make positive change in my campuses. And so, I think that we only hold so much power within that, and as much as we would want it to, be some nationally recognized program, I'd much rather have it be that everybody's kind of taking this within their own sense of responsibility and engaging in these conversations and pushing that forward.
Marley, do you have anything to add?
Ditto to those. And then also, I think something that we hinted at both in my study and in one of the studies that you mentioned, and it's also something that I'm super passionate about, so I'm going to try to dampen down some of the extra enthusiasm, but the need for having these types of interventions much, much earlier than what we're doing. In terms of raising consciousness should already be raised by the time that students come to college, and then reinforced and applied to the context that college presents. But if we really want to make lasting cultural effects, a larger culture exists beyond the college campus, and at much earlier ages, we see great culture occurring. Most sexual violence perpetrators start well before they reach college age, so it's a hint that this stuff really needs to be happening way, way, way sooner. And that's all I'll say about that.
I think those are great points, and I think, we have hopes of moving. And for you, if you see this video and you're interested in the program, it's a free program. We're happy to have you use it, to talk to you about it. We have, as Mike said, a bystander program that we created that's really rooted in bringing in the bystander, and that has some adjustments that we made that we call it empowering the bystander, and then also define it, and then we have define it that's specifically for LGBTQ. But as Marley said, in doing the study, something we really saw is like, maybe it's just for everybody, but has a conversation. It's inclusive of the LGBTQ experience. And so I think that's the next step that I hope we'll take, is start looking at the adapted program for people who don't identify within the queer community and seeing the effects that might have as well. All right, well, thanks for joining us and getting this far. Hope you have a great APA virtual experience, and thank you so much to our wonderful presenters.
Thank you all.